Kick off your boots and put down your hunting knife. It's time for the Outdoor Man Podcast with the man himself, Outdoor Man Dan. Join us for fun stories, useful how-tos, and insights into what being an outdoorsman means today and what it may mean in the future. From ethical hunting and conservation to new stories to tell around the fire. Let's get into today's show with your host, Outdoor Man Dan.
Welcome to this week's episode. This week's episode is a special one. It is the Christmas one. Look, Christmas tree, Christmas t-shirt. I mean, nothing says more like Christmassy than Die Hard. And if you say I'm wrong, then you're wrong. But no, this show is with Simon Whitehead. Now, Simon is just an knowledgeable guy when it comes to lurchers and ferrets. But not only that, he has actually made a living out of being a warrener. Now, the warrener job is very much a dying trade, unfortunately. I wish it was still about because that is my ideal job. But there we go. So have a listen to what Simon's got to say. It's really interesting. He has a really interesting take on it, whether you're for the hunting and just the conservation or vice versa. It's really worth putting your listeners on and getting amongst it. So cool. So without further ado, Merry Christmas. Have a good New Year. And if you want to hear anything else in this next year coming, any topics, any people, topics, anything like that, get in touch and I will see if I can make that happen. So until next year, enjoy. I'll forward you someone.
Right. Well, I grew up in Teesside. Dad worked for British Steel, so when British Steel went bang in the 80s, we moved to Lowestoft, 84 I think it was. I basically left school at 15 and went to work on a market garden in Parham, Hatchiston actually, in Nobby Clark. And the passion for ferreting, when I was up north, I was always out and fucking about in the countryside and doing this and doing that. But didn't actually do any, but you always watched and read and interested in nature. And then when I moved down to Lowestoft, I just wanted to go ferreting. So I went ferreting there, and then I moved to a place nearer home and went ferreting at what was I, 16 at the
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. 15, 16, I'll leave it there. 15, 16 at the dairy farm, which is now the rifle range in Pakefield next to Pontins.
Okay, yeah.
And it sort of grew from there, really. And then, so I was into me ferreting and me dogs, so I had lurchers. And then you were trying to fit in with, at the time, society. Because if you can imagine, in the middle of the 80s, there weren't many foreigners in Lowestoft.
Yeah.
So
they're still in.
No, there's a lot of this. So you went to work. I went to work for the print works in Lowestoft, and they couldn't understand a word I said. So literally, I started work there, and they put a notebook and pen around my neck because they couldn't understand me. And if they did that now, you can imagine the consequence of that. But they couldn't understand why you'd want to go out ferreting or running your dog and this and that. But again, it's the obsessive nature of what you're passionate about. It's like you'd work one ferret and then the ferrets weren't the best, and then they weren't handled the best, and then you get better at that, and then you get a better hutch, and then you get more ferrets, and then you're not happy with the nets. But at this time, there was no internet. So you were like reliant on magazines and books or seeing people at game fairs. And that brought like a beautiful naivety to it because you just learnt from mistakes. So our early fixed net long nets had dowling and bamboo canes, and because we didn't really understand about where we could get, there was no carbon fibre poles then. So you were using like garden sticks and stuff. Because we didn't know about hazel because nobody in the area dropped a traditional long net, and so then you learn about hazel stick. And so
game changer.
You just, but then my whole philosophy on ferreting was born, because being a thinker, you think, well, why bother putting all these purse nets down when I can just surround the net and have my dog in the middle? And then that basically transformed my ferreting. So at the beginnings, when all we had was like homemade nets or the brine brinded system, you then started to get little stop nets through hedges, and then you started to think and read a warren rather than just ruck up and go ferreting. Because if you think about it, North Suffolk, everybody shot, but nobody ferreted.
Yeah.
A lot of people would come out and wanted to shoot the rabbits, but I prefer to net them. Although I did shoot a great deal of rabbits with the guns because it was just like easier. But
depends where you are, isn't
the
it?
passion was with the nets and the dogs, and you then sort of get better quality nets, better made nets, and then you think about the ferrets, and then you then work on a lot more hobs than you are gills, and then they're getting them castrated because we're ferreting later, and then sort of I got to a point in my middle 20s where you were rabbiting at when you could. You obviously you're buying a house, you're settling down, you've got to try and be responsible and earn money and everything else what people contend with. But I had this burning passion to like just make me living from rabbiting, and you say, oh, well, this is what I want to do, and you look at other people doing, and you think, well, on the outside it looks rosy, but looking back now it wasn't. But you think back then, looking at them, you think, oh, that'd be brilliant, but you don't realise that's not really their job. They've got other jobs that pay the money, and then they just like portray what they're doing. And then I went to work for a pest control company, but at that time I started going on at the BFSS stands and promoting ferreting, because when I was at game fairs I quickly found out that there was no promotion of ferreting, and the people that didn't ferret, they were just like showmen.
Yeah. Racing ferrets on the tubes and
or going in the arena and saying they caught 10,000 rabbits a year, and they were fantastic, when in reality all they wanted to do was sell ferrets and flog the books. So I started to do that, and then I still quite fancied this rabbiting thing, and then I started doing a bit of writing, because I'm not educated, but I know my subject. So I started doing a few articles for the Countryman's, and I did a little book. And in the late 90s, I sat under a tree at Burley Horse Trials and wrote this book in 3 days and self-published that, and just to try and get stuff out there. And then it was like the start of the internet, and then you realise how you just lambasted. The internet is it's like this massive seesaw of good and evil, and then you think, well, is it really worth it? And then you think, yeah, of course it is, but I still fancy doing it. So I had looking at the people doing the demonstrations, and I was doing these static displays in my holidays, and then I had a huge fallout at work over money. Surprise, surprise, where I was like suspended for like 6 months or something, because we played the system, because I knew I wasn't going back, so it would give me time to set up what was then my company. So once people found out I was rabbiting full time, I had like some rabbiting work come in, and once the show people found out I was going to do shows, instantly I got like 15 shows.
Really?
So I then had to fathom out a demonstration. So my first ever demonstration I did was at Newmarket Races for a Countryside Alliance fundraiser, but it just happened to be live on Channel 4 Racing. So if it wasn't bad enough going in a ring for the first time ever with all these little props I'd made out of paper mache and stuff, with a lurcher that just didn't want to know about toy rabbits, and it was live on TV, and I'll never forget Leslie Graham picking one of my ferrets up and half strangling it on a live interview, and you just I had to get around it, which you do, and then sort of more writing come and books come, but me ferreting just sort of went off in its own direction. So when I was called into jobs around here in Suffolk and Norfolk and Essex, you suss the rabbits out. And my philosophy has always been, it's not so much about catching rabbits, it's about not letting rabbits go. And even at this day, a lot of people can't get their head around it, which is why the long nets were essential in how I ferreted. Because when you surround the hedgerows and dissect them, the worst that's going to happen is the rabbit's going to bounce off the net and go back under the ground. It's not going anywhere. Whereas if you put purse nets everywhere, 2 rabbits come out, a rabbit ran off. And then when you put a dog into the equation to put a bit of pressure on the rabbit, 9 times out of 10, that's going to turn left instead of right. It's going to run into a net and not go back under the ground. A good dog will limit the amount that can go under the ground, but at the end of the day, it can't be everywhere. So then you can mix and match it. You can put a few purse nets down if you want, or you can put more stop nets down. At the hedgerows, I just preferred stop nets because logistically it was easier. You cut a few gaps and you completely surround the area, but it was all down to the long nets and quickly sussing out that with a little bit of extra work to begin with, you're not doing no more work until you're finished. So you turn up with like 10 baskets and people go, oh, that's a bit overkill. But then you do, 200 yard of hedge, you're not doing no more netting that day. So you're just letting the warrens settle, putting your ferrets in. And then you're looking at your ferrets and getting better ferrets and finding ferrets from around the country. And, people have driven up to the top of the country to pick ferrets up for me, and ferrets have gone everywhere. So over the years, the ferrets have been refined to have a very high prey drive, and you look at them differently. So instead of having little cages, you have big runs, and then instead of having one ferret, you'll have teams. So in the hutches, you'll have like 5 or 6 together. So when you put them in boxes and work them together, there's going to be no squabbles. Neutered so they don't come into season, but then you have some studs and some gills you're going to, and everything is result based, and then your reputation grows. So like I did no advertising, if there's a rabbit problem, they just bring a farmer up and we know him, and that's how I got Rix's. Somebody 60 miles away, his son went on works experience in a farm down here. So when they had rabbits, they go, we'll just ring Chippy up and see if he knows anybody. And then that's how I ended up working in Essex. So it was a fantastic, wasn't very financially viable. Yeah, you made a living, but without the shows, you couldn't make the living rabbiting because the farmers around here just weren't going to pay a great deal. And it wasn't until you worked for like the forestry commissions or the construction people did you then bump your money up, and then it just progressed from there to then when the shows really kicked off for me, and you're getting more known around the country, you've then got to battle not so much the antis but the trouble within. So over the years, I've had, I don't know, dozens of death threats and this and that going on, and mail checked and all sorts of stuff associated with what I do. But that's not half the hassle you get from people within the rabbiting world, because they always want, and I have this saying, they always want to do what I do till they have to do what I do. So mentally that sort of plays heavily on you, because you know what it's like, you just want to, you think you can please everybody, but in reality now you're not going to please everybody. So you're going through progressing with the shows, and I'd work out what shows I want, and you've got to run a business. As a business, you run that. So you get to a point where you're doing all the shows, all the big game fairs, all the shows. You got a nice little rabbiting round, but then you've almost like reinventing yourself, because if you keep still and complacent and stable in what you're doing, after a few years, it's just like you become irrelevant. So it must have been 2007 or 8 when really we were getting a lot of media interest about rabbits as food, because up until then nobody really wanted to know about cooking rabbit. seen as vermin by the associations and organisations, and that kick-started me into filming and doing. I did a field to fork about preparing and cooking rabbit, and then we did a few. I knew people that did the cookery demos, and I was always like in the shadows. And then a few years later, I come out of the shadows, and even to this day, people sort of gaslight you into thinking you're not as good as them, whereas in reality, my experiences from the past 5 years is, these chefs you see and these people, these influencers, in reality they don't know nothing, and it's just been a massive learning curve, but it's drawing inspirations from outside my world. So for the ferreting, it's to me it's about your mindset, and this is where the fitness comes in now, because with being in the hills and taking people out or working, we're working. I'm now working for other companies all over the country. You've got to be on the ball and make the decisions, and if you're not you're not hydrated and you're not fed well. Come 1 o'clock, you're getting sloppy, tired, and you don't want to be there. Well, when you got to do a physical thing like ferreting, and when you're clearing rabbits, it's not jovial ferreting, and this is the difference between industrial ferreting for pest control and ferreting for fun. You've got to almost take it personal and get every rabbit. You're not going to get every rabbit, but you've got to go in there believing you can get every rabbit.
They're there for a job to do at the end of the day.
And that is outlined by how you set things out and how you perform. And that's all that. Again, we just all coming back to these long nets.
Yeah.
Without these long nets, we wouldn't be able to do. But on the flip side, now the long net's that popular, anybody can do what we used to do, because back then they didn't have the equipment and they didn't have the knowledge, whereas now everybody can get the equipment and just go on YouTube or message somebody, and they can instantly, because it's not rocket science to lay a long net. You just got to walk and put a peg in the ground.
Yeah, you're going to catch something, aren't you?
Yeah, the mystique has been taken completely away from it, but that's evolution. So nowadays it's just all about enjoyment. I'm at a stage now where I can look back and talk about, and this is why I've changed stance on my book, because you can look back and think, what a cock you were back then. You and I see it in people coming up now. Everybody when they're younger thinks they know it all, and they look at the older people thinking you know nothing. And then when you get to be that older person, you look back at the youngsters thinking, well, you're just peacocking around, but you don't really know nothing. And it's still the same today, but it is different today than it was.
I had that with Dad. Dad, when I was learning to be a keeper, Dad was like, you just stand still all of a sudden and walk around traps, because Dad used to be old school. And we stood down for, well, you might hear something, might you, boy? Come on, let's fucking get on. And off we'd go. And it weren't till really only a few years ago where that penny dropped with me. If I stand still here long enough, instead of me chasing that fox across that field, that's probably going to come to me. Or I might just hear that fox, or and that's when, like you said, young and naive, you know it all.
It is, and this is why a lot of people got onto me about changing tact on my book, for several factors, because life has changed, and there's no secret, there's not the rabbits there. So commercial rabbit clearing isn't even have gone. Ferreting is getting stronger and stronger, because people are now coming back into it. They want it for the food, they want it for the stress relief, enjoyment. And to be fair, when you're ferreting with a dog, it's possibly the best sport in the world.
When it's all going right.
When everything's right, depending where you are, it could be the best thing in the world. And you look back, and you can now read warrants, and you're right, you have the experience, and you just get these gut reactions and intuitions, and you learn from your mistakes, and to a lot of people a ferret's a ferret, but you can tell by their demeanour and how they work a warren what's going on. And a dog, there's a lot of myth and folklore and old wives' tales about dogs. But I think a lot of people now just want it put in plain and simple black and white. You know, there's a lot of people coming into ferret. I mean, my phone, it's like ferret hotline.
Yeah.
You know, people have been messaging me and ringing me up all day and night, asking the most basic of questions. And it's a bit of a crying shame, because when we were growing up, we didn't have the internet, and they had telegrams and post boxes, and we learned from mistakes, but at least it stuck.
Yeah.
Whereas now, I feel, you know, a lot of people have too much information, because not all information is right information.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to get ready is a guide. I'm not sure what it'll be called. It's basically going to be a guide. Sorry,
It's all right.
a guide to ferreting, and then it's aimed at the beginners or the returners, and everybody else if they're broad-minded enough to read between the lines.
Yeah.
So when you read the narrative, it's not going to be put out in black and white, but you will know what's going on, because we're now ferreting in the summer a lot more. Things are changing. We're now a lot more people are using dogs, and then in a few years, I dare say, the purse nets will come back into vogue, and then the long nets will come back into vogue.
Yeah. The same as shooting, isn't it? 1 year it's a side by side, then it's the over and over.
And then you've got your ferreting with birds of prey, which I love. Shooting over ferrets, ferreting with dogs, ferreting with nets. You know, ferreting near roads. You know, how do you work a sandy warren? How do you work a peaty warren? And I just think if I can get all this mumbo jumbo down in a book, and then match them with Craig's pictures, which I've got, I think that'll be like a nice little, almost like a coffee table book. So there's loads of pretty pictures, which everybody wants in books.
Yeah.
They want good action pictures, and then they want the words in between. And then at the end, there's going to be like a big butchery, storage, preparation, cooking guide, because I was originally going to redo the cookbook, but I'm now putting that back until the autumn to finish that off, because I want to test all the 50 recipes myself. So, and that's going to take...
What are you putting in at 50?
50 recipes.
You'll be sick of rabbit by the time you finish.
Yeah, but I've got some friends going to test some recipes.
Yeah. You can't just test it yourself, because your taste buds are the same.
Yeah, I'm going to test the ones I like. So the ones without bones in, I'll probably test. And then I've got friends that are really good cooks, so they'll do the bit more difficult ones. Yeah. Butchering a rabbit ain't hard. You know, there's only so many ways you can butcher it. Yeah. You know, there's no point having 360 pages on how to butcher a rabbit, because it's basically the simplest thing in the world once you've done a few. But that is the saviour of ferreting in a way, because if there's one thing I've learned over the years, is when you answer people's moral dilemma about taking an animal's life by showing that you're putting it in for food, then you sort of pacified their interests. And doing what I do in the summer and the shows and the media work I do, you realise that we've got this big snowball going down the hill, and we're never going to stop it. We can just steer it into a safe area, and by promoting all game as meat, but especially rabbit. And I'm amazed the fitness world ain't cottoned onto rabbit.
I'm doing a talk with a company actually about this.
And the it's a way of, I wouldn't say making them understand, because when I was younger, you know what it's like, you always wanted to make people want to go ferreting and ferreting. Well, I couldn't give a fuck, because as long as you give them the facts, just let them make their own mind up.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I think they act and react differently to you. So, you do your demos, or you talk to people, or you do one of your talks, and you can put the facts to them, and then they might say, "Well, I don't agree with it." Fair enough, you don't agree with it.
At least you're educated, don't you?
You're educated, because the threat isn't going to go away.
No.
And
It's going to get worse. Not
and with the way and the power of the image and social media is, I just think we just got to continue in changing how we portray it.
Yeah.
And that comes with the writing as well. You know, there's certain words you don't use, certain words you do use, you don't use. You know, the way you explain it. And I just think we've got to think about the bigger picture.
Yeah. And we all have, and that's something that I've been trying to push. And you probably heard quite dramatically through the podcast, is the fact that, you know, if we don't start educating people on why this needs to be happening, it's all going to go. It's simple. And
I'm amazed because, I mean, venison, there's that much venison running around the country. Why people don't utilise it more? I mean, why there's, you know, I know you got great people like Mike Robinson getting in the papers and doing his programmes and through education and everything else, trying to get people to realise that, you know, we have got this problem with venison, with deer. But why don't people utilise venison more? Why is it we're still buying New Zealand venison in the supermarkets when everywhere there's
more than enough in the country?
You know, so it's all about education now.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and that's, well, I'll say the reason I started the podcast. You know, my two little girls. I said that. I don't know if you heard me say it on at the end of my latest podcast, but I don't care what my girls do as long as they're happy.
Yeah.
But if they want to be an animal activist, they can understand why we're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's all it is.
I think that's important because when my daughter Grace was growing up, she probably saw more dead rabbits than anybody. But she's a little pink princess and just likes the horses. And everybody assumes that you'll take them out. But she's been out ferreting a few times with her friends.
Yeah.
But there's not, I mean, you're not going to force it on anybody. No. Because there's nothing worse than imposing your will on somebody else. And I remember what it's like when people try and impose their will on you when you're trying to do things.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, we just got to be different and think different.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, I remember Dad saying to me, yeah, when I was ever saying, "Oh, do you come shoot some pigeons tonight, boy?" "Not really." "Oh, can't that be fun?" "Yeah, not really." Wasn't interested at all.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got into my teens where it sort of flipped back, and then.
I also think the on like putting our point across is, I also think we're also getting better at not being that stereotypical image of what you do.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that amongst the media now, there's a lot less of the starchiness.
Yeah.
And they're bringing more, because I mean, there's still not enough out there about women that do things, children that do things. There's still not enough about what good people are doing with game, you know, and how it's benefiting people. And I just think with the demise, I mean, speaking personally, with the demise of the rabbit as it is, and, you know, you're almost trying to conserve a craft. If you don't get the education right, then there's going to come a point where that decision will be made for us about the rabbits. So, like, if the rabbits get really low, would somebody in the government say, well, you can't do it?
Yeah.
You know, and this is what I don't want.
That's what's going to happen with deer, but the other way.
I still think, you know, we'll be putting rabbits back, but apart from a few strongholds, you know, the numbers are down. The conservation people are now spitting the dummies out because they've just realised that they are so low. But what I don't want to see is, you know, you waking up one morning and then somebody from natural England has made a decision to put the rabbits on a list. Yeah. You know.
Yeah, it'd be a sad day.
Because everybody, I mean, even the farmers and the people you work for, you know, they hate the rabbits, but they never want to see the last rabbit go. And I know what it was like from filming. You know, you spend more time filming rabbits and looking at rabbits and understanding about their behaviour purely from a, you know, I want to know about them so you can control them better. But then part of me thinks, well, if you're putting them back, why don't they get in touch with people that remove them to protect them, going back full circle to the old Warreners? But they never will, because you know, they're letting their own thoughts blinker, you know, the good of an animal. So I hope the rabbit is going to make a comeback.
That's the one thing I've always said, and it comes with Warreners. I hadn't actually looked at that through them glasses, but the people who can produce animals in the country, like gamekeepers, you know, fantastic at producing wildlife, and people don't ever see that.
No. Well, they're not called gamekeepers now. They got land managers.
Yeah, land managers. That's what they are.
But it's you know, and it's like, I don't think people realise how much of a struggle some of these rabbits have. You know, simple things like the construction industry. You know, you got roads and parks. I mean, I ferreted for the A14 relief road at Bar Hill. Bar Hill, we've never seen rabbits like it. But as soon as that road went through, they all disappeared. And it's the same everywhere else. The ditches are getting digged out, roads are going in. It's all pressure and stress on the rabbit, and they're just not going to cope with it.
They're not in. And the two-way rabbits aren't anymore where they used to be a lot of us in the railway, on the side of the railway lines. No. You don't see them like they used to along there.
No.
Like we were talking about Manningtree earlier on. I remember going to the bridge where the station is there, and then if you looked to your right or your left, actually, we go to grass fields. That was always heaving of rabbits.
Yeah.
Not a lot.
VHD went through Manningtree 4 or 5 years ago, because I used to know a few lads that ferreted and shot down there, and once it's been through. It's like it's just wiped it out, and it's a bit sad to see, really, but that's life. I'm afraid we you know, life now isn't what it was in the middle of the 80s.
Yeah.
And part of me wishes it was, but then again, you know, it is changing. It is changing on all ways.
One thing that's always struck me, I remember going to a farm walk years ago around Knights's farm at Marham, and the keeper who was there, he's not there now, he was said, I just hit him hard here, hit everything hard here and it comes back harder. And that phrase has always sort of stuck with me. And when I first started over at Ardley, I hit everything hard. And I think that's a little bit of truth in it. I've had rabbits come back in places. I'm not saying that's the answer to everything, but I think a bit of a shake-up now and again
void and vacuum
isn't a bad thing at all.
If you create a void and you've got a reservoir, it will always fill it in. And you're right. Problem is, where you don't have a reservoir, then you know you're doing. And this is the age-old argument between doing a job and doing it for fun. I mean, now I'm not as hard on the. Don't get me wrong. If I'm paid to do a job, and I've recently been up Scotland to do a few jobs in islands and stuff, we've hit them hard. I've told Charlie we're going in the car to Jonas Theatre, and he's sort of sorting all that out. I want to get it out because it's been 11 years since the last ferreting book. Now, I brought the last ferreting book out 11 years ago. When I look back on it, I know absolutely fuck all about it, really, in the grand terms of what I know now, because like what we're talking about, experience, you think you know it all then, but you're just a bit of a cock, and then you realise that, and then you just sort of grow into your skin, and so I'm going to get the book out. It won't take me long to finish it off. I say the pictures are there, just got to get it laid out and printed and stuff. And then volume 2 will be the cookbook, which will be done properly. Everything's got to be, recipe wise, everything's got to be tested. Because I like to do things right, so I'll test the recipes.
Cool beans. Thank you very much.
So yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to the Outdoor Man Podcast. We're glad you're here. We'd love to connect with you on social media. Find us on Twitter at Podcast Outdoor, on Instagram, outdoor_man_podcast, on Facebook, Outdoor Man Podcast, and you can even reach us by email, dan@outdoorman.uk. Let us know your outdoor questions, and be sure to tag us when you're outside living your best life. Until next time, be the example.